Today we're revisiting the most difficult combat cycle boss in DC Dark Legion, the Drowned. I've been told that my original Drowned video was probably one of the most helpful that I've made for combat cycle. It's definitely one of the ones that's getting the most traction, the most views. And I am really happy to see that some people have found it useful, but I thought it would be a good idea to try to jump in and maybe do an update or follow up to that video to talk about phase 2, because it's definitely a little bit more difficult of a phase, and to kind of talk a little bit more about why some of the champions are going to be better against the Drowned than some of the others. So we're going to jump over into our roster and we'll go through a few of the champions that I've highlighted that I think are some of the most impactful. I will be putting together a graphic for this boss. I know I already have one out there, so I'll probably be updating that graphic or creating a new one just so that you guys have kind of a reference sheet, a quick reference guide for either you or your friends who are having to struggle with the Drown trying to get to phase 2, or for people in phase 2 who are trying to push their scores and maybe they didn't have access to a certain champion and then they get it later. So hopefully that graphic will be helpful. But for now, we'll go through the roster and just kind of talk through some of these champions, and maybe we'll revisit the other graphic and talk about some things that may have changed since the last video that was made. Definitely going to be some new champions that are included here in my recommendations that we didn't have access to before. And then we're also going to take a look at my best run so far for Drowned this week, which includes a lot of those champions that we're going to be talking about today. So I hope you find that helpful as well. And let's go ahead and jump in to our review. Before we start the champion review, let's go ahead and take a look at the kit for the Drowned. Now, I did spend a decent amount of time talking through the kit on the original video that I made, so I may be repeating some information if you've already watched that one, but I do think it would be helpful to kind of case our discussion with talk about a little bit of these kit details. So first thing is, in phase 2, there is going to be kind of a difficulty increase. The Drowned is going to be stronger. She's going to have more attack, defense, and min. So she's going to have a little bit of a resistance against both physical and spiritual damage. And then she's also going to have a 30% bonus to effect resistance. So it's going to be a little bit more difficult to put debuffs onto her, damage over time, abilities, things like that. The Drowned's kit kind of revolves around a mechanic called Dead Water. Dead Water will reduce your champion's movement speed. And so right off the bat, you know that it's going to be really difficult for champions who are melee kind of bruiser characters, your guardians and warriors specifically, to do much damage against the Drown, because it's going to be harder for them to get places. And then we'll look at some of the other effects which will make it even more difficult for them to even get to the boss to do damage in the first place. But the Drowned has this self-modification passive, which means that her basic attacks have a chance to apply the Dead Water ability and will periodically remove debuffs from her, so it's kind of a cleanse as well. So she's going to have this ability called Water Bomb, and it's going to go off periodically. You can kind of see the bomb form. It does look kind of like the icon here, and then it will deal AoE damage to your entire team, and then it also has a chance to apply a stack of Dead Water. So Dead Water on basic abilities, Dead Water on these more special abilities as well. Dark Surge is the ability that I was talking about that makes it difficult for physical damage dealers to get up close to the target, and it's going to basically be an AoE knockback that will just push your champions further back on the screen. And then the most devastating of her abilities, the Dark Wave, which is this huge pillar of water that's going to shoot around, and it reminds me of a World of Warcraft boss from the Burning Crusade. Anybody remembers that one? But basically, it's going to incapacitate your team. You're not going to be able to attack for a certain amount of time, and the more Dead Water stacks that you have on you, the longer the incapacitation effect lasts. Now, this will cleanse all of the Dead Water stacks that you have on you when it happens, but then she's going to start doing abilities again. So like while you're incapacitated, you're going to start taking more stacks again, which is kind of annoying. We will talk about Stargirl a little bit. She is the only champion really that can cleanse this. But, my old recommendation was that you should definitely try to use her, even if you don't put force into her. I'm not sure that she's going to be that useful in phase 2. She definitely isn't useful for me, and I have her at low blue stars, but we'll talk about that later. But that's the basic gist for how her character kit works. Okay, so first let's talk about my original Drowned infographic. And I still think that some of the same concepts or strategy here still applies. But when I made this graphic again, I was trying to help newer global launch players who might not have access to the full array of champions. I did include some of the champions that they didn't have access to, like Constantine and Zatanna, but I was trying to use kind of the best of what you probably had available if you were only playing the game for just a few weeks. And so that's why you're going to see some things on here from the free to play and light spin perspective that probably don't make a lot of sense for the Drown, but it's kind of just the champions that you have that you can actually use. What you're going to see, and I had a chance to put together a new graphic for this video, and what you'll see in that new graphic is a different way of recommending how to build your team out. And you're also going to see much fewer of the melee champions. So for example, just immediately, Harley Quinn is no longer in my recommended champions, neither is Batman. And on top of that, you're going to see a couple of other champions who've really kind of fallen off now that we have a lot more Mythic Plus champions available to us, the limited bleed champions, and then a few other champions that have come into the game. So champions like Penguin. Penguin has been removed from here. I've also removed, and you'll see the structure in just a second, but I've removed Superman from kind of the whale best champions because frankly there are better options out there than using Superman unless you just have him super well built and that's all you have. The other recommendation you'll see here, the big strategy when I put this first infographic out was to try to utilize your Ivy. The Ivy vines kind of help soak some of those stacks of the dark water up, and then use her in conjunction with Stargirl to cleanse as many stacks as possible. And then you could use champions like Superman and Harley and Batman because they could get to the boss a little bit faster and they were able to get their ultimates off, etc. So that was a big part of the strategy. What has happened is Stargirl was sort of nerfed a little bit and she's just not as effective at removing stacks. She can remove one at a time, and at low stars, it's just not really that helpful. So that sort of strategy still is in play to an extent for newer players who are in phase 1. In phase 2, it really just doesn't work at all. I still think Ivy is a champion worth using, and I think Stargirl is still in the mix as well. But you just have to keep in mind that it's going to be more of a maybe not necessarily whale strategy, but definitely a strategy for people who have been playing the game a little bit longer. Okay, so here's your first look at the new infographic, and you'll see that I have changed the categories into viable options. So champions that, if this is all you have available, you can use them, or for very specific strategies, some of them are incredibly helpful. We have support champions, we have best damage dealers, and then we have our healers. And I did give a little bit of a write-up down at the bottom, just some basic thoughts on kind of why I included what I did. Some people won't watch the video, so it will help them understand some of the choices. But let's just talk through this a little bit. So, your viable options, and maybe we can start with Superman. I mentioned that Superman is not super helpful in phase 2 unless you have a very specific strategy and you're able to just kind of power through all of the dark water and the reduced movement speed and still get those ultimates out. You really do need Stargirl if you're going to try to do that, and you need her relatively well developed to get through it. But he's not exactly the best win condition for this game mode anymore. Champions like Red Hood and Black Adam and Green Arrow, I would say Two-Face to an extent, are all going to be fairly decent for this game mode, especially for newer players. Two-Face is probably the worst of that bunch, but they all offer a little bit of, really nice DPS stationary. Now, Red Hood obviously is his ultimate's going to fly him up in the air, but for the most part, he's sitting stationary. And so those are going to be really good options for you. Lex Luthor and Captain Cold probably could have went into the support category for this section, because I think for Lex Luthor, he's obviously only going to make a lot of sense in a Legion of Doom team. And, I think that there are some really good Legion of Doom champions in the mix here, Sinestro and Deathstroke being incredibly useful. And then I think, if you're going for a spiritual damage comp, I do think Scarecrow is worth using. But the idea behind the Legion of Doom team is to try to get your energy gain as high as possible. And, your true win conditions or biggest damage dealers are going to be Deathstroke and Sinestro. So you really want to be able to pump them up as much as possible. The other champion that is included here that I think is really worth mentioning now, and you've probably seen in my previous videos how much I didn't like Captain Cold, but now that his ultimate is actually fixed, he is going to be incredibly useful in things like Combat Cycle, because his ultimate basically allows you to deal a massive amount of physical damage to champions. And it's actually, until you have your cyborg built up a little bit, a 5 red star or even a 5 yellow star Captain Cold is going to be able to do considerable amounts of, or help you do considerable amounts of physical damage. So I've included Captain Cold here specifically for that. He's not going to do a lot of damage himself, but when that ultimate goes off, as long as that debuff is stuck to the boss, you're going to see huge numbers pop up. And just to give you an example, I'll throw on screen here for just a second a comp that I did right before the Drowned reset in Combat Cycle, where I was using Nightwing and Green Arrow as my main damage dealers, and I was using Captain Cold and Cyborg in kind of roles to try to augment their damage. And I was able to do quite a lot of damage with this team setup. It definitely was not close to my highest score, but that was mainly because I started losing champions, needed a little bit more healing. And I'm curious if I can play around with this, whether this might be one of the best comps that I have going forward. I doubt it, because I have a lot of heavy spiritual damage dealers who are able to do a little bit more, and you'll see that later in the video. But I just want to show you a comp using Captain Cold that actually works, and it's really fun to watch it in action. Moving back over to the main graphic, we talked about a couple of support champions here. We'll talk about a few more. So Stargirl, we've already kind of spent a decent amount of time on. Definitely worth using in some team comps. I think you're going to have champions like Scarecrow, who I've included here because he can augment the damage of your spiritual damage dealers. So I think if you were trying to run something that included Constantine and Sinestro or Joker, then you probably want to just experiment with Scarecrow and see what he can do for you as well, because he's going to be able to throw debuffs on the boss that will allow Constantine and Sinestro to do a little bit more damage. I think Zatanna goes in that same bucket with your Scarecrow, and Zatanna is probably going to be a little bit better of an option here because she's stationary. She's not relying on, melee and being close to the boss to be able to get her to do her own damage, and she's obviously going to have much more damage output. So kind of a good and better options there for augmenting your spiritual damage dealers. And then we've got a couple of other champions here that can augment your physical damage dealing. We talked about Captain Cold. We also have Batgirl and Cyborg listed here. Now, Batgirl I typically wouldn't list because I don't think she's that great of a champion, but specifically with Nightwing, she is. And I've seen quite a few team comps where with Nightwing and Robin heavily built, like into the red stars, where throwing in your Cyborg and Batgirl with them, and then a healer like I think a lot of people have been using Starfire, is going to allow you to do a ton of damage, not just to the drowned, but a lot of other bosses as well. So I did include both of those here. We've got Fate, because Fate is going to throw up shields. He could almost be thrown in the healer section here. He's going to offer a lot of protection for your team and try to keep you alive through those periods of incapacitation because of the Dark Wave ability. And then finally, we have Flash, who is just an incredible all-around support. I've definitely been moving him higher and higher in my tier list each month because it's just hard to ignore the impact of a champion who is able to just help keep cycling the ultimates of your best damage dealers. So definitely a champion that I would recommend here. He does die a little bit early against the drowned, but I still think he's definitely viable in all the combat cycle bosses, really. So definitely worth your consideration. Now, for healers, I've included all of them here because I think you're going to need a decent amount of healing. You need at least one healer on the team. I've seen some success with some teams that have two healers because you're just trying to keep your damage dealers alive as long as possible. So, experiment around with what you have. Everybody's going to have access to Mira, but you're probably trying to build up at least one of these other healers. And for some of the folks on the older servers, you will have access to Starfire at this point. Starfire in Blue Stars is going to be relatively viable. We're getting a lot more options for healers, and it's going to help with these combat cycle bosses as we get a few more of those into the game. Jumping into the best damage dealers for the drowned, there are 6 here that I think are really worth highlighting. We've talked about some of them already. We have 3 spiritual damage dealers, and then we have 3 assassins. And I'm definitely seeing, a handful of different team comps that will utilize 1 or 2 of these champions. You don't need all of them, but having at least one of these champions on your team is going to ensure that you're going to be able to put up a decent amount of numbers, big numbers against the drowned. So you'll see that I ran Constantine with Sinestro and just tried to buff them as much as possible with spiritual damage. You can run other comps where you're trying to do the same thing with, let's say, your Sinestro and Joker. But I've found that the biggest damage dealers against the boss lately have been some of these assassin class heroes. So you've got a lot of these comps that will run Nightwing with Robin. I mentioned that, where you're trying to augment their damage with Cyborg, Batgirl, Captain Cold. At this point, we'll see what some of those comps look like. I think some of the folks in the top 50 on 204 were definitely using Captain Cold to get their Nightwing's damage a little bit higher, similar to the comp that I showed you. But I think there are a lot of good teams that you can build from this group, and I also can see a lot of teams that are possible from the very beginning of a new account, where you can start trying to put something together that's actually meaningful, that you can kind of grow into as you obtain some of the limited bleed mythics or some of the other mythic champions at higher stars where they actually become viable. Take a look at the rankings. You can see what a couple of the heavy hitters on my server 204 have been able to do. A lot of these teams are using Nightwing now, so Nightwing is definitely one of the best combat cycle champions that you can use. You'll notice there's a lot of spiritual damage. There's a lot of champions who are able to attack from just standing stationary. So range DPS. Some people are able to use their flash very effectively, and you can see that my roster, I think I may barely stay in the top 20 here, but I've definitely tried to focus on a spiritual damage composition. I spent a lot of time this weekend or today trying to figure out what would work the best for me this week. And this is, I think, the highest damage that I've been able to do in phase 2. Pretty happy with it. And we can take a look at what this looks like in practice. And you can see kind of the basic strategy here is I'm trying to give myself a little bit more health. We're doing that with a 5 energy wielder team, and then obviously trying to give our Constantine a little bit more spiritual amp. I have tried some comps that have Nightwing in them, and I've gotten around the 14 to 15 million mark with the same setup or a similar setup. But for whatever reason, I just couldn't get my Nightwing to work too well, because you really need a lot of those Bat Family or Teen Titan synergies so that you can give them a little bit more crit amp and crit damage. And, you know, I do have a couple of Titans in here, so I've been experimenting with that. But again, this is the best that I've been able to do. Let's take a look at how it pans out. And so you can see there's going to be that periodic pushback. And there was, I believe, there's the bomb. The bomb just inflicted some of those dark waters. And I believe we should be coming up on the surge that's going to incapacitate everyone. You see we got a decent amount of stacks there. And so now we're going to be stationary for a few seconds. It does remove the stacks whenever the surge happens, but then you can see that those basic attacks were able to go ahead and start putting more stacks on us. And this is just, you know, the effects are amplified in phase 2 from what you deal with in phase 1. And it's very substantial. So it's a lot more difficult to do well against this boss. We have it on auto right now, so I'm not sure what the score is going to end up being, but I know sometimes I will try to do it manually as well, and sometimes I can get better scores doing it that way. It just kind of, it varies a little bit, but we'll see if maybe this auto run will give us a higher score than we had before. We are getting pretty low. Sometimes Raven waits way too long to heal, so that could be a problem. We end up losing Raven on some of the runs that I've done. We're back up to those 5 stacks. 15 million. This is definitely the best that I've done around this point. If we can get access to those other champions, maybe we get another Constantine ult, we might actually beat the other high score. It's going to be pretty close though. Yeah, so we barely beat our other high score, 18 million. But this should give you a general idea. We stayed at the same rank, but gives you a general idea of what you're trying to accomplish here. We talked through a lot of the types of champions that you would want to try to use in a drowned setup. And I think this is definitely the hardest boss that we have to face in Combat Cycle. I know a lot of people, the only reason that they can't get to phase 2 is because they're still waiting to get enough damage against the drown. So I don't know. Obviously, this video is geared towards trying to get better scores in phase 2, but I really think it will apply to phase 1 as well. So definitely go back and take a look at the first video that I made, but I think this kind of update video is probably going to be just as helpful, if not more helpful, for anyone who has more advanced rosters and has access to all of these champions. You know, the first time I made the video, I was trying to help global launch players who may not have access to some of the more advanced, longer term bleed champions, but I've started making a lot more content for people who have access to most of the roster. Now that we have a lot more of the global launch crowd, you know, getting to Constantine and the bleed and kind of catching up to some of us who have been playing the game since before launch. Let me know if this video was helpful for you. I'll definitely be making some more phase 2 Combat Cycle videos in the future to kind of augment some of the ones that we've made over the last couple of months. If you have any advice or anything that maybe you didn't see covered in this video that you think would be helpful, definitely leave that as a comment below. And if I find one that I really like or that I think I would be really helpful to the community, I'll definitely pin that comment so that you get a little bit more visibility. And I appreciate you watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.